Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome. If you could take your seats, please. Thank you very much for coming. We're delighted that you're here tonight for a really special event for us. My name is John Waters. I'm Director of Studies in the Irish Studies program at Glucksman Ireland House, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. The first order of business, there's some very smart, witty, funny people who are going to be on this stage in a minute, and if your cell phone goes off, I pity you. So join me now, please, and silence the beast. There's no ringing cell phones, if we may, during tonight's events. And also, for reasons that I think would be apparent if these lights were shining in your face, please, we have a number of requirements. One is no flash photography, please, no flash photography, and especially no filming. Cameras will, most especially, all cameras, including press cameras, will be turned off for a special event at the end of tonight's occasion. I'd like to just briefly begin by thanking the two sponsoring institutions. The first for the Arthur Carter Journalism Institute at New York University and Professor Brooke Kroger of the chair. We thank you very much for your co-sponsorship of this event. I also, indeed, thank you. And I should say that Pete Hamill, who put this event together, is now visiting professor and distinguished faculty in the Carter Journalism Institute. I also want to say a special thanks to my colleagues and the staff at Glucksman Ireland House, particularly to Dr. Eileen Riley, who have pulled together an event for 480 that started as an event for 120, an extraordinary feat in a short amount of time. Please thank Eileen for me. Thank you. I'm going to do something that needs no doing at all, and that's to introduce Pete Hamill. Every person in this room knows what a treat Pete Hamill is. This event was Pete's brainchild and his inspiration, and it's his connections and the love that people bear for Pete that is going to fill the stage in a moment with an extraordinary array of talent. In a moment, you'll hear Pete Hamill's voice. When you hear Pete Hamill's voice, the room gets smaller, and you know you're going to hear a good story. So please join me in welcoming Pete Hamill.
We have an amazing number of people. As you can see by the number of chairs, it looks like the jury at the John Gotti trial or something. Come on out, folks. Gail on the end. Gail, right there. Yeah. It's an absolute honor for me to be here tonight to celebrate my friend, the man who made so many of us proud to be newspaper men and newspaper women. In a celebration that is at once an Irish-American celebration, which is one reason why Glucksman Ireland House is one of the sponsors, a journalistic celebration, and a New York celebration. You can't tell the story of American journalism for the last 50 years without mentioning Breslin. And you're a fool to try to write the history of New York for the last 50 years without consulting his work. He epitomizes in many ways George Bernard Shaw's famous line, another Irishman, by the way, who said, "I've had a wonderful education except for school." Breslin's education had two main strands. The one, and maybe the most important, was hard times. He was born at the beginning of the Depression, the Great Depression. that makes today look like softball. And he grew up understanding something about poverty. But also, he understood the other lesson of many of the people, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Polish, German, who lived through those hard years, that you could live through hard times and not feel self-pity. That was the unforgivable sin after cruelty. And so he grew up in a time when kids would get deposit on the milk bottles, 3 cents a bottle, to be able to afford a piece of candy in a candy store. He grew up in a time where it was much more common to have day-old bread than fresh bread. He grew up in a time where leftovers were part of the deal. And he grew up with the radio, the music of the radio, because the beginning of talk radio didn't really happen yet. The evening was given over to talk, and I'm sure Jimmy has the same memory I had, that if there was a God, it sounded like Franklin D. Roosevelt. When you heard that voice, you said, "Oh my God." The other part of his education was a place called the Long Island Press. Jimmy had been a caddy, he'd been a lifeguard, and it still swims now. I don't know how many times a week, but it used to be 5 days a week. He even played for a while the trumpet. Music was saved from an ignominious fate. When he was hired as a copy boy at the Long Island Press, and began his apprenticeship, because at the time, personnel managers didn't hire people. There were no personnel managers. There were people called editors who sensed something in a kid and say, let's give this kid a chance. And so he learned his craft from craftsmen, from the people who had learned themselves the hard way about the imperfect trade of journalism. Some of it he learned, as most of us did, in saloons after the shift ended. But the craft of the time was passed on by those people from the Long Island Press, and it led Breslin into the life that he had and the joy that we've had knowing his work above all. It was first stop was the Journal American, where he wrote a column on the same page, or sometimes alternating with a great master not known to many people anymore named Frank Graham. I'm sure he was reading a wonderful writer named Bill Hines, who worked at The Sun and later wrote for magazines. But finally, when he came in 1963 to the Herald Tribune to write his city-side column for the first time, we knew something, we who worked in newspapers at the time, knew that something fresh and new had happened to the city. Jimmy took some of the craft of sports writing and applied it to the people who actually lived in the city one at a time. And he used that technique to bring to life a city that had never been fully covered for a long time. He wrote a column, therefore he was entitled to opinion, but the opinion was based on the reporting. When he did express it, he had a great knack for not saying it and letting the reader say it, which was based again on the reporting. He also gave us the other side of life in this city, which is not always the people in politics or law or government, not always the people who commit amazing felonies and are famous for 3.5 days. He gave us Fat Thomas. He gave us Marvin the Torch. He gave us Klein the lawyer. What a group that was. They're all now around a table somewhere in heaven, awaiting new arrivals, I think. But they were people who lived in the city. I met them. People would say, he had to make up Fat Thomas. Not if you met him. And so he brought another sense of New York, of the way New York could be, to that paper. But most important, the lessons of hard times were with him. When Jimmy climbed the stairs of a tenement and went up 4 flights to the first floor, to the 4th floor right, and knocked on a door, people didn't have to explain what it meant to be poor in the richest city in the world. He knew. It was in his DNA. And they sensed it because they would tell him what their lives were about. They would tell him what was behind the story that pulled him up those stairs to knock on their doors. He knew in his guts and his bones and his heart what they were. And so he did that thing that every good journalist tries to do, to give voice to the voiceless. And he opened worlds to me and to many others, because once he started that column, every paper in town wanted a column that was like that was about the city, that was not about cosmic issues or abstractions or the latest boring drivel from Washington, no matter what it was. He also helped people by doing that. Most of us don't remember the people he helped, and I suspect Jimmy doesn't remember a lot of the people he helped, but they remember. They remember that he's the guy that put the story in the paper that made people pay attention to them, one at a time. I could go on for a long time about Jimmy because I've known him so long, and it's been a privilege knowing him. But we have here this amazing group of people, all of whom know different aspects of him. So think of Jimmy as a kind of cubist painting in the making here that will be seen from different angles by everybody here. And I'd like to start with someone I'm very fond of, who's a wonderful columnist, getting better as she goes along, like good wine. Somebody who worked at the Daily News, someone who worked at Newsday, the first woman to edit the editorial page of the New York Times, and now a sparkling, wonderful columnist, Gail Collins. That was not Gail Collins down there. This is Gail Collins.
Thank you, Pete. I've never gotten a welcome like that before in my life. Gee whiz. Usually at events like this, I feel kind of serene because I'm not afraid to speak in public. However, I am terrified of Jimmy Breslin. So I come here with, a certain amount of trepidation. I'm armed only with one anecdote and one quote, because those of you in the business know that then all you need is one factoid, and you've got the column right there together. And here's my quote. "He's the best columnist I have ever read. He has a fanatic heart. He writes every piece as though he figured on quitting next week. He never saves anything. He seems to me a model for us all. He's a force of nature with all the excesses and the great instincts of a force of nature." And that was Murray Kempton. So say we all. And I will give you my one favorite Jimmy Breslin of all time anecdotes. When I was at the Daily News and Jimmy was at the Daily News, there came a time when he was working on the stun gun stories, which would lead to the Pulitzer. I was working on the neighborhood column, which would lead to becoming the Statue of Liberty birthday party reporter. But we were both still there, and we had the same editor, actually, a woman named Sharon Rosenhaus, who had very strong opinions about things. And she was working with Jimmy, she was working with me, but she was working with Jimmy, and it was incredible. I have never heard so much yelling, and I've never been in armed combat, but that was the closest I have ever been. Banging and slamming and doors, and by the end, by the time the series was over, they not only could not be in the same room, they could not be on the same block in the city together. So the Pulitzer came. The Pulitzer was announced. Everybody was waiting. You know, we kind of knew we'd get it. And it had been a long time between Pulitzers at the Daily News at that point. So everybody was thrilled, and they wheeled out the champagne. It was terrible champagne. It was the Daily News, but still, it was champagne, you know. All the editors are there, and all the plastic cups are there, and everyone is waiting and waiting, waiting and waiting. And finally, Jimmy really did come, and, you know, he walked up. You know, everybody's applauding and applauding and applauding. He said, "This award actually belongs to Sharon Rosenhaus, but I'm not speaking to her." And at that moment, he won my heart, and he has it to this very day. And I thank you so much and salute you, Jim.
The next speaker spent most of his life at the Daily News, starting in 1956. Before that, he had worked for wire service, and before that, he had been a soldier in World War II. He was a great editor. He first starting in Washington, and then top editor at the Daily News, who had the great wisdom to hire Jimmy Breslin. This was after the Herald Tribune went down and its successor, the Widget, and there are some people here, probably two, who remember the Widget. And he spent his lifetime making the Daily News a tabloid that was more than a tabloid. It was as good as it gets, and we had great fun there. Please welcome Mike O'Neill.
Thank you, Pete. First thing I have to report is that Jimmy Breslin's expense accounts were shambles, a complete shambles all the time he was with us, and we were always in trouble with the business office. Secondly, his disrespect for the editorials of the paper did not go over well with the publisher. But he said that he absolutely ruled out any compromise. As he explained it during a summit meeting at a local bar, it was in the best interests of both him and the editors to go their separate ways. In this manner, he explained, we were covering all sides of public issues so that the maximum number of readers would be pleased. The logic was awesome. Of course, it helped to remember that Breslin was the paper's star attraction, regularly leading reader reports, surveys, topping even heavy hitters like Ann Landers, and helping his employers sell a lot of newspapers. He was, in fact, a valid link a valid link to the historic working class base, the working class